Good afternoon to those of you following us in Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, and good morning to our participants in the Western Hemisphere. So my name is Erik Berglof. I'm the Chief Economist of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB. You're all very welcome to join this webinar, which is part of a series that we are organizing together with the Center for Economic Policy Research, the LSE, and the AIIB. We have named this series the Global Commons Room because we want to discuss our common global challenges and how research across disciplines and across different parts of the world can help us make progress on addressing these challenges. So today's topic is reforming the international institutions, the case of the WTO. Thinking about this issue of reforming the international institutions is of course particularly pertinent for me as I have just joined AIIB, one of the most recent additions to the sort of flora and fauna of international institutions. And in a young institution, you think about these issues all the time. Almost everything you do is sort of consequential for the future of the institutions, and you're trying to learn, of course, from the successes and failures of others all the time. But I've also worked in older and more established institutions where you have more delivery capacity in many dimensions, but where change is so much more difficult to achieve as interests have become more entrenched and silos inhibit discussions across departmental boundaries and where governance institutions may find it more difficult to exercise effective control. So we are now right in the middle of perhaps the most serious challenge to the global community since the Second World War. The international institutions that were created since that event at the middle of the 20th century, these institutions are now being tested like never before. We have seen the challenges to the WHO and calls for it to be reformed in the midst of the pandemic. We've seen the capacity of the IMF and the international development finance institutions are being stretched to their utmost, and here the ideas for reforms of the global financial systems, for example, those proposed by the G20 Eminent Persons Group, have largely been shelved, or at least put on hold, as the focus is really now on responding to the economic and social impact of the pandemic. So the WTO has also been affected directly by the crisis, and there have been many interventions by governments to secure supplies and restrict exports of medical equipment and drugs. But in the case of the WTO, it had really been neutered in several respects already before the pandemic broke out. As we know, the appellate body had lost its quorum and could no longer adjudicate in the disputes between member states. Some large countries have preferred bilateral agreements, and the US administration has renewed sort of the use of tariffs to achieve its objectives, often bypassing or ignoring WTO. Today we would like to look at reforming international institutions in general, but maybe using WTO as an example. And there have been, of course, a number of reform proposals that have been highlighted because of the ongoing selection process for the new Director General. And I understand that we are now down to the final three in that process. So with us today, we have a fantastic panel to discuss these issues. They have between them extraordinary experience from several of these institutions, including the WTO. But it's just a somewhat different panel from our previous webinars. Normally we have sort of an academic research paper at the core and then invite academics and policymakers to discuss. Today there is no such paper or papers, but all the panelists have made very interesting contributions to the reform discussions. But I think it's fair to say that this is an area where research is very much lagging practice. We don't have very good analytical tools for thinking about these very complex international institutions. And if you compare the progress that we have made in sort of conceptualizing corporate governance, we still have much progress to make on how to think about these institutions and how to improve them and make them more effective in achieving our global objectives. So that's what I want to discuss today. As I said, we have a fantastic panel. I'm going to introduce them as we go through them. We'll then have some questions. We'll start with the questions from students, but then we will open it up for Q&A. And if you want to put questions forward, please put them in the Q&A and please identify yourself and your institution. So without further ado, I want to introduce a friend, and Hector Torres. And Hector has a unique, I think, experience in the sense that he has been both in the WTO, in the appellate body, and he's been on the board of the IMF, I think, perhaps even representing two different constituencies, or at least he has had a long experience from the IMF. And so Hector, I really want to give you the floor now, and please, of course, you are Argentinian, I should have said also, which may be important. We are very keen to have different perspectives on this issue. So please, Hector.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very honored to be in this panel. And I will try to use my time to make the case about why this is the time to discuss how to preserve global institutions. We need to reform them. It's difficult to imagine that you can preserve them as they stand. This is a polarized world, increasingly polarized. And the subject of today about preserving multilateral institutions is not just a theoretically important subject. It is about preserving, because if you don't preserve multilateral institutions, middle power countries will have a hard time in avoiding being cornered to take sides in this increasingly polarized world. And that's certainly not something that would benefit anybody, particularly middle powers and small countries. Why do we need to reform to preserve? Well, let's be honest. We all are used to blame President Trump for many things, but the problems that globalization have been breeding for a long time. And I will go briefly through these problems because I'm sure everybody is pretty aware. So we have a globalization that has been mostly shaped by what today we can see as socially unsustainable rules, and the results particularly are being questioned by large sectors of our societies. The free movement of capital is fine, but capital have been able to arbitrate different, opportunities around the world. But at the same time, they have put governments to compete with subsidies, tax breaks, and even wage moderation to retain investments or attract investments. And you have financial innovation, which is has been a way to conceal risk. We have seen that in 2008. Society understood, I would say correctly, that it was about my profits and our risks. And that has, of course, undermined the support for globalization. Then we have, of course, trade liberalization has lowered prices, has brought lots of people, particularly in China, out from poverty, and some other developing countries. Not that China is particularly a developing country, I don't want to make that point. But the labor's share of national income has decreased in almost all G20 countries. So you have less poverty, you have more inequality. You cannot adjudicate that only to trade, but trade is certainly part of that. Then you have, of course, happy consumers, capped wages, because, of course, bringing this since China got into the world economy, of course, you are competing with salaries that certainly reflect different social preferences. And then trade liberalization is also good, but the bad thing is that it trumps on social and environmental standards, and that also requires to be reseen. Now, that's not the only reason why we have to reform this. The COVID-19 has, I would say, made apparent everybody's reliance, or all countries' reliance on foreign suppliers. But governments, the first reaction was a reasonable reaction. Let's protect family first. That's why I put there, secure your oxygen mask before assisting others. That's precisely what we are advised every time we go on a flight. Now, that reasonable impulse of protecting family first led many countries to halt exports of essential goods. And of course, national security concerns rised, and I would say the self-sufficiently hardliners lost no time in calling for the repatriation of supply lines. Now, we have a serious risk of moving from a rules-based system into a deals-based system. And of course, President Trump has a lot to do with this. I would say the principal architect of the rules-based order that emerged after the Second World War came with a new motto, which is, we come first. And if we come first, rules don't mind that much. And of course, the confidence resulted eroded. Confidence on multilateralism and multilateral institution and rules that have been agreed on a consensus basis in multilateral institutions. Now, confidence is the fuel. Confidence on the effectiveness of the rules-based order is the fuel of multilateralism. Now, the problem is that the two pillars of economic interdependence, the economic interdependence that has been built in the world, which is the WTO and the IMF, are having serious problems. We will delve on the WTO, but I will make parallelisms with the IMF because as I will argue, they have very interesting asymmetries in the need of reforms in themselves. The WTO can no longer enforce the trade rules. Deals are superseding rules. And at the IMF, which looks much better than what the WTO looks, there is also problems. The COVID had, Kristalina Georgieva 3 days ago gave a very interesting speech in which, in a nutshell, she said very much what's happening. Advanced economies, or rich economies, if you want, including some emerging markets, are doing whatever it takes to protect their firms and their workers. But most of the developing world doesn't have that luxury, and they just do whatever is possible. The IMF is denouncing this, but it works in the margins. Advanced economies have provided a massive fiscal support at about between $12 and $13 trillion, which is almost one China's GDP a year. And plus, you have all these called monetary measures, which are mostly quasi-fiscal support, because central banks are buying even shares, they're buying debt, private debt, of course, not just public debt. And all this provides massive support. It's not bad, but the point is that it cannot be matched on the other side. The IMF has provided $280 billion in support to 81 countries, which is a fraction of what it estimated as necessary. It was 2.5 trillion. And mostly it was provided through two emergency lines, which are the rapid financing instrument and the rapid credit line, which is for least developed countries. And they are limited to 100% of the quota per year. Quotas, as we will see, or I will mention, are very small in respect to the GDP of countries and the need of support of the countries. It has also provided some lines, interesting lines and prestigious lines as the FCL, flexible credit line to Chile and Peru and increase Colombia's. But basically, it has failed to issue new SDRs, which was one thing that everybody was expecting, that it would contribute with some liquidity, that it could, of course, help developing countries, not because they would receive most of it, but because those that receive most of it could lend it to the IMF again. And more importantly, it has not been able to break the glass of it, whatever it takes clause, which is the emergency clause that is Article 27 that would allow it, for instance, to offer collateral to countries in need. It would allow it to do whatever it takes. Now, it has not been able to break that glass, despite that this is a huge crisis. Now, then let's go into the WTO. The WTO, the rules-based trading system has been cracking for a long time. Now it's agonizing. Problems have been swept under the carpet for a long time. And since January 2017, the carpet is no longer there to be swept, to receive new problems. That's, I would say, a merit of President Trump. Geopolitical tensions have exacerbated these old problems, and that coming mostly from some dysfunctional working practices that the WTO has been following and not reforming. And I will mention 3 dysfunctional working practices that need to be reformed. The first is the way consensus is interpreted at the WTO as mostly the right to block almost anything, even to gain leverage in negotiations, even to block discussions. So the instinct of a trade negotiator, if he hears that I want something, he would say no, and then he would exchange the no for something. So that is the way consensus is being used. It has been very difficult to make progress with such a practice. Now, the second one is the way the WTO has been providing something that is basically a derogation from the general rules to so-called developing countries. In the WTO, countries can be developing forever, and they claim to need this crutch, I would say, which is special and differential treatment, this derogation from general rules across the board on all industries, meaning countries like my own country, Argentina, which is very efficient in agriculture exports, would not give up its special and differential treatment on agriculture, for instance. Or China is not willing to accept that it is no need for special and differential treatment in everything that is manufacturing, and there are many other examples that I can. So, and the third problem, which is possibly the most politically sensitive problem, is that WTO rules have been designed in the assumption that trade takes place mostly between private parties that pursue only commercial interests. Now, China has been flourishing on a model that has challenged that. It is a centrally planned capitalist country in which it's very difficult to discern what is public, what is private. There is a gray zone, and nobody understands very well what is the influence of the government on corporate decisions. So those are the things that need to be reformed. Then we have the disputes, as Eric mentioned. We have been asking the United States to say, the United States says, we don't want to kill the dispute settlement, we just want to go back to 1995. And everybody has been asking the United States, please tell us what is going back to 1995. Well, it has tell us what it was. And now we have the answer that we didn't want to get. They want a single just panels, the single stage process, and a mechanism to set aside, as they say, erroneous opinions, which suggest that they want to do without negative consensus. The G20 has paid lip service, at least, to that question of reforms. Now, a little bit of a parallelism with the IMF. The IMF has a single governance structure for 2 very different functions. The most known function, at least between borrowing countries, is the lender of last resort. And the decisions at the IMF are taken quite fast because there's weighted voting. there's those two problems with weighted voting. The first is how you weight votes. That depends on quotas and how you calculate quotas. But the second problem is that the other function, which is not less important than the first one, is of an independent supervisor that has to speak truth to power. And now, so if you have more, one vote is $1 is one vote, that's okay, that's perfectly fine for the lending function, assuming that quotas are well calculated, which are not. But let's, for the sake of the argument, that they are. So, but how can you ensure that a $1 one vote doesn't transform weighted voting in weighted influence on what the IMF is, I would say, advising to countries, is proposing to countries as reforms? I'm not implying that it happens all the time, but there is a serious concern about even-handedness in the policy advice of the IMF, and we can discuss further on that. Now, look at this map. This is a map that reflects the quota share of countries at the IMF. The IMF is basically has remained a North Atlantic organization, and that is a serious problem. You have in this chart you have IMF quotas, which is this the orange, and you have the IMF the GDP of every country. You see that it needs to make more room for China and for India. Mostly, it needs to make more room for Asia if it wants to be a truly universal organization in which countries feel equally represented and can feel that the advice coming from there, they feel ownership for that, for the organization itself. Now, the problem is, and this is the next point I want to make, is that big emerging markets that at the WTO claim that they're not ready to compete on an equal footing because they are developing, at the IMF make a very reasonable argument saying we are ready to play in the top tier division of the IMF, but not at the top tier division of the WTO. There we are still developing. Contrary to this, in the EU, the US and Japan are telling emerging markets at the WTO, you are equals to us, you are ready to assume equal responsibilities, you are competitive enough. But they're not ready to treat them as equals at the IMF. And that's a serious problem. This is my last one. I think that the WTO cannot be reformed from inside. That's why I bring this, this parallelism with the IMF. It is not possible to have, there's this contrasting asymmetries. Emerging markets need to accept more responsibilities at the WTO, and the IMF has to make more room for them at the IMF. That's the trade-off that can be done to reform both organizations. You cannot expect them to be adults in Washington and treat them as teens in Geneva. That's it. Now, developing, I would say, S&D, special and differential treatment, has to be reviewed, but we shouldn't get into arcane discussions about who is developing and who is developed. I would say that we have to go down to earth, start by low-hanging fruit, and make a question that every country should ask and say, in what industrial sector are you ready to compete on an equal footing? And then you don't need S&D over there in that sector. That would be the start. But S&D has to be related with domestic policies. It cannot replace domestic policies. It can only support domestic policy, buttress domestic policies. So there has to be a discussion about what kind of S&D you need to match your domestic policies. And I would say we should bring the World Bank, UNCTAD, and possibly other organizations as the ILO and the OECD into that discussion. And finally, let me say about, let me say about China. There's no way we can progress on WTO reform if China believes it is about reforming China. It should be very clear that reforming WTO is not about imposing on China the Western model of corporate governance. Companies should only, the Western model is that companies should only pursue the interest of shareholders. But what it is about is that it is necessary for all members to be able to share light on the role of governments in corporate governance. So choose your model, but show us your hand. And that's the end of my presentation today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hector. There's a lot of food for thought there. Wonderfully provocative and very interesting comparisons between these two institutions that you have both served in or governed rather than served, perhaps. So the next speaker, we are very honored to have Jonathan Freed. I don't know how to really present him. He's probably the most senior Canadian diplomat. He has worked, of course, as an ambassador and permanent representative to Canada in the WTO. He has been the executive director for one of the Canadian constituency at the IMF. He's also been sort of inside doing the work of as a finance deputy in G7 and G20. That's where all this work on reforming the institutions should happen. We had hoped. So maybe, Jonathan, you can give your perspective on this issue of reforming the international institutions with your broad experience. You have also been ambassador to Tokyo and been involved in the negotiations with China, and China joined the WTO. So from all those experiences, what do you take to this topic?
Well, thank you, Eric, and thank you, Piroska, and to the LSE and the AIIB for bringing us together. I'm going to build on Hector's observations, but take a little different tack in a couple of respects. Number one, I'm going to offer a slightly less pessimistic perspective, and number two, I'm going to go from the immediate to the medium-term prospects for reform. I have a number of slides. I'm not going to go page by page, but at least they will provide some guidance if those can be loaded onto the screen. So first and foremost, let's just remind ourselves of the context overall, and you can proceed with the slides, in which this debate is occurring. Next page, please. There is, as you can see, the two major dips from the financial crisis and now from COVID in terms of where we are on overall growth. Oops, go back a page. And significantly, the sources of growth are shifting from being reliant on Western developed economies to emerging economies being the source of future growth. In fact, by 2030, 2/3 of the world's middle class will be found in Asia. And that's reflected, as you can see, on the right-hand graph of this slide, where projections for growth show slowing in developed economies and rapid growth in the share of world trade accounted for by China and by the BRICS overall. So that's simply the context to remind ourselves, as Hector has pointed out, as reflected in quotas, where GDP will come from in the coming years. So let's move on, if we can, to say that far from breaking down completely, open trade is being pursued, but being pursued in a somewhat haphazard way. The famous spaghetti bowl of free trade agreements simply reflects the fact that gravity matters, that countries and their businesses are attracted to facilitating trade, certainly within their neighborhoods, and to some extent in reinforcing supply chains across neighborhoods. And that trend is continuing, notwithstanding some of the calls for further protectionism. So it's against that backdrop that we need to look at where the international trading system is. So let's carry on from there, if we could, please. I'm sorry if the clicking is a bit slow. So let's just remind ourselves what the WTO is all about. There's tremendous focus on dispute settlement as the so-called jewel in the crown, but that's only part of what the WTO was created to do. It has other pillars. It is an ongoing monitoring institution, as is the IMF through its annual Article 4 reviews of each and every member country. So too, through the various committees and working groups and councils of the WTO and its trade policy review mechanism, it is an institution that maintains ongoing surveillance of how we're doing in abiding by the rules. And although it's not a major source of donor funding, the WTO is a coordinating institution for technical assistance and capacity building for developing countries throughout the world so as to better embrace and take advantage of trade. Click again, because there's a fourth and key pillar of the WTO, and that is it is chartered through its ministerial council to be a rule-making body, traditionally done through so-called rounds, packaging a so-called single undertaking. But throughout its history, and most recently through the Trade Facilitation Agreement agreed in 2013, it has been able to develop rules, at least in specific areas. So let's carry on, please. And let's take a look at whether, as some people suggest, the WTO is on a respirator and is nearly dead and nearly irrelevant, or whether, as I will argue, it actually deserves a slightly better, at least mixed review. So let's take each of these pillars in turn and move through fairly quickly. Click again, please. If we could move on to the next slide. So on monitoring and surveillance, as I said, this is an ongoing process. And although it's very small print, in the last 2 years, you can see how many countries have been subject to multilateral review, a challenge function where members can ask and probe and encourage better behavior on behalf of their colleagues. That's all publicly available. And frankly, behaviorally, being subject to such review without having to go to dispute settlement has a constructive effect on how countries decide to update and reform their own domestic rules so as to better conform to the international discipline. So don't underestimate the continuing impact of trade policy reviews. And that's as true of China and the United States as it is for least developed and other developing countries. That's accompanied, if we can carry on, click again, by, as I said, what the WTO requires of countries to notify their counterparts in the various committees on a specialized basis as to what their new measures are, and to subject themselves to challenge and questioning. And notwithstanding what Hector suggested about trade restrictions, countries have been very forthcoming at the WTO in explaining that, yes, we do have to protect our own citizens first, but here's how we've done it. And here's why it's not unduly trade restrictive. We're prepared to engage in some dialogue. So the left-hand side shows just how many notifications have been forthcoming and volunteered in the spirit of transparency and openness by countries taking such measures to their counterpart countries. So underlying that is a sentiment that while there is some necessity on short-term measures, countries are prepared to engage in dialogue to sort out how better to return to a normal state of affairs on masks, PPEs, ventilators, and so on. And the upper right chart shows that notifications are not limited to those advanced economies. In fact, Uganda has been among the most forthcoming in explaining and notifying new measures taken at home. The last available data is 2018. It's not that much different since then. Nonetheless, according to the independent Global Trade Alert, we are seeing continued implementation of trade restrictive measures, but particularly on subsidies. And that doesn't differentiate between domestic support, which may be non-distorting, and trade distorting export subsidies or similar such measures. Click again, please. So all of which is to say, on one of the pillars, on notifications, on surveillance, the WTO is not doing a bad job. Similarly, on technical assistance, both within the WTO itself and by collaborating with other institutions, such as with UNCTAD, as they jointly own the International Trade Center. 7 different international organizations collaborate on the Standards and Trade Development Facility with the United Nations through the Enhanced Integrated Framework and so on. The process of raising the level of literacy and capacity in an operational way among developing countries is not an unimpressive record. There is an annual Aid for Trade Global Review that provides some impetus for continuous improvement. It's been delayed this year for obvious reasons, but the coordination and the track record is actually impressive. So again, my submission to you is don't underestimate the positive side of the WTO on this second pillar. Let's carry on and click the slide again. On dispute settlement. So what's interesting here, if you look at the right-hand chart, is that in the early days of the WTO, there were quite a few disputes initiated. Why? The argument, I think, that's convincing in this regard was negotiators reached a number of agreements in the Uruguay round. They may have settled on some constructive ambiguity and blurriness in the rules, and countries sought clarification with some frequency as to what those rules really meant. For a long time thereafter, dispute settlement tailed off a bit, and the frequency of challenges diminished significantly until recently, and this only goes up to 2018. You can see that resort to the appellate body, colored in green, was not that frequent in any event. What's interesting on the left-hand side is who uses dispute settlement. And here, this is framed in terms of the United States as a frequent litigant, is that notwithstanding all the publicity surrounding the US versus China, the most frequent disputes of all are between the United States and the EU, interestingly enough, going both ways as to who the complainant is and who the respondent is. However, the other significant thing about who uses the system, if you run down the list, is that it's not limited to the big boys and girls in the room. Whether Argentina or the Philippines, Brazil or India, they also all have resort to the system. So I'm not sure it's fair to say we've moved from a system of rules to a system of deals, because if you add up not only the resort to the dispute settlement system, but to the implementation of decisions made, it's fair to say that most countries, most of the time, regarding most of the rules, abide by the system. So overall, the WTO and its dispute settlement system has not a bad record. But there are some shortcomings, as Hector talked about, and I'll come back to them. So let's move on. Click again. So what about the rulemaking function? Mr. Lighthizer has argued that, in effect, countries are seeking to legislate through litigate. And that may be true because we've been stalled for some time in the Doha development agenda, going back to 2002. I would suggest that the key to unlocking rulemaking rests in the agriculture field. We all know that in most countries, farmers have a disproportionately loud voice, and in many developing countries account for a significant share of employment, and thus domestic support levels remain very high, and the rulemaking fell short in the Uruguay round. The right-hand side is simply meant to show that the bigger the agreement may be going forward in agriculture, the bigger the results will be in other areas. And without progress on agricultural subsidies, there will be a brake put on other areas. But we're stalled, admittedly. So let's move on, because I offer this in part because there's so much focus on industrial subsidies, we need to refocus on agricultural subsidies. What else is missing? Well, Hector has hinted at some of them. I would argue that the WTO, although it has a small agreement on trade-related investment measures, still hasn't come to grips with the significance of investment as a means of doing business. After all, trade follows investment and investment follows trade. If someone makes an investment, be it greenfield or taking over a local factory or production facilities, supply chains and suppliers will grow around that investment. So it is an enhancer to growth. The right-hand chart shows that notwithstanding a fall off in investment overall, the bottom light blue line is the trend in investment. I'm sorry, I didn't produce the legend large enough, but the light blue line shows a fairly consistent, although slow, steady rise in investment in developing countries, even if total world investment has been tailing off even pre-COVID. UNCTAD does project, notwithstanding the current tail off of a resurgence of investment on the left-hand side, looking out to 2022. Click the next slide, please. What else is missing from rulemaking? The reality of supply chains. And it's Pascal Lamy, I think, coined the phrase that goods are made in the world these days. If you take apart a computer or an iPad, you will find componentry from various countries, so it's hard to say whose product it actually is. There is, however, a challenge, as the middle chart shows, in tracing a supply chain from the design of a product through to its production, through to its marketing and the surrounding services, where developing countries are stuck at the bottom of the so-called smile. And we need to find ways and rules that facilitate smooth supply chains so that developing countries can better embrace both the start and the end of production. And we've not had meaningful diagnosis and discussion of how to integrate a supply chain perspective into rulemaking. What's interesting here, again, focusing on the middle chart, is, it's a terrible word, but the servicification of goods trade. Embedded in the trade in goods are a number of services ranging from financing to design, to marketing, to accounting, and so on. How do we take an integrated approach to measure what are the barriers and what are the facilitators in promoting supply chain? Notwithstanding this bottom of the smile, the left-hand chart shows that many countries in many parts of the world are already significant participants in global value chain production. Click ahead, next slide, please. So another aspect that we're way behind on international rules is in regard to the impact of digitalization, similar to supply chains overall. If you trace the impact of the digital economy on production, again, many countries involved when you start with the design and move through to production and the import to the end user. That gets bottled up and jammed up by a number of digitally related policies, including restrictions on the flow of data, on sales and transactions, on intellectual property, and so on. That's why you have so many countries now, over 80, who are promoting some WTO rulemaking on e-commerce, but that will only deal with a part of this. Some of it belongs to the World Intellectual Property Organization, the International Telecommunications Union, taxation authorities, and so on. So even with WTO rulemaking, we'll only be addressing a part of the digital challenge. Moving on, next slide. Hector already talked about competing models of industrial organization. There is no doubt that the Chinese-led model of state capitalism, and they're not the only country that has significant state involvement at the in the economy, poses the question of how do you marry competing systems. This is not to say, as Hector rightly said, that the proposal should be everyone needs to move to market economy models, but rather what we need is rules that permit the leveling of the playing field between differing economic systems. And that remains a challenge and remains a gap in current rulemaking. So moving on, next slide. There are further challenges and further gaps, whether climate change or oceans. The rules regarding the interface between trade rules and environmental rules needs to be clarified. As more and more countries seek to address climate change, for example, through carbon pricing or carbon taxation, that raises a question as to whether a competitor who doesn't have to pay a carbon price or who isn't taxed has an unfair advantage. We don't have clear rules on how to level the playing field between countries who are aggressively attacking climate change through such measures and those who are not yet there. Go on. Next slide, please. If we can get to the next slide. So again, building on Hector, the question, whoops, back one. The question of development is now very much at issue. We're going back, you're going forward instead of backwards. Back again, one more. And one more again, please. If we can go backwards, there. Triggered by the United States, where the argument is not all, oops, forward one. Not all developing countries are alike. China is not Uganda. in the World Bank and the IMF, we recognize low versus middle versus high income developing countries. Why the WTO can't do the same is an open question. The United States has made a particular proposal to not formally graduate countries, but at least to align the level of discipline and the level of acceptance of the rules with the level of development. Some countries have volunteered to accept a higher level of obligation, including Singapore, Brazil, Taiwan, the Emirates. And that's a debate that needs to be had. The additional dimension to this, as Hector hinted at, is why we cannot take inspiration from the trade facilitation agreement, which is to say special and differential treatment is a fair point, that some countries are not in a position to accept the full level of obligation because they don't have the capacity to do so. But instead of allowing a permanent excuse why we cannot invest in capacity building along with the timetable for the phasing in of obligations, so as to allow countries to grow into the same level of obligation. That's turning S&D from a negative to a positive approach. It's been done through the trade facilitation agreement. It's a model that could be applied across other disciplines as well. So I'm continuing on what in effect is a long list of negotiating issues. Next slide.
Jonathan, can we, you have so much interesting information here, but we need to get closer.
I'm just about done. So I'm simply adding to the negotiating list. We all know about Trump and national security and when that's a legitimate excuse and whether it's reviewable. Next slide. If we can click on, please. So, with all of this at issue, dispute settlement and rulemaking in particular, how do you move the agenda forward? Hector said you can't do it from within. You can, to some extent, build out a consensus, not by holding a general assembly, not by putting things on the table and have 164 countries and a cacophony of voices try and reach an agreement all at once. You have to build out consensus, and you build it out by caucusing. You build it out from starting with like-minded. This is a chart the WTO itself produced on agriculture negotiations, showing how many different voices intersect and help to build out what hopefully becomes a common view. Next slide. So too, and after all, this is part of the point, the intergovernmental groups falling outside the WTO, ranging from the G7 to the G77 and the G20 in between. So to illustrate, next slide, please, the G20 itself, again, often criticized for a do-nothing body, next slide, actually has produced some not insignificant results. Can we click, please? The Ottawa group, which is a middle powers group, met most recently in June at the ministerial level, helped to reinforce the removal of temporary restrictions on medical devices on COVID, and the G20 trade ministers met also in June, and actually, even as between the United States and China, even as between India and South Africa on the one hand, and the developed world on the other, did agree at the ministerial level that the WTO continues to provide a floor and that they're prepared to reinvest in trying to find a path to reform. It's not a rule-making body, but it is a caucus. And it's not an insignificant caucus, as the right hand shows, even looking ahead to 2040, the G20 dwarfs just about any other grouping in terms of its weight and impact in being fairly representative of the global economy. All of which is to say, and I'll conclude here, that, to sum up, the WTO is not as bad as people suggest. There is a crying need for a rule-making agenda, first and foremost, and dispute settlement is in effect simply the implementation of whatever rules are agreed. And there are ways through caucusing, through the G20, through the Ottawa Group, through the G77 and otherwise, to begin to build out consensus. The fault is not with the institution. The burden is more on capitals and their ministers to pursue those discussions. And then to finish up, just to come full circle to where Eric started the whole discussion off, governments and their officials will benefit greatly from public policy analysis and evidence-based research to help to help point the way for officials to engage in those discussions. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. In a very positive spirit, I think this was a very Canadian presentation in the sense that it's both very balanced and fair and also very constructive. And I think that's what's been Canada's, and I know your approach to this as well. So thank you very much for that. And there are many things we will come back to, I hope, in the discussion. So the next speaker is Marek Belka, very dear and old friend of mine. I know he's young, of course, but very. He has, of course, very extensive experience first from his country, Poland, as finance minister and prime minister and central bank governor at the later stage. In between, he was head of the European department during a very critical period of the IMF and the global financial crisis. So, Marek, what is your take on how we can reform these institutions?
Okay, thank you. Well, first, let's start with the black swan that came upon us. Well, was it a black swan entirely? Well, it was, because we were not prepared to this pandemic, but we were not prepared to the scale of the damage that it can bear on the global economy, rather than the very fact that it came upon us. Let me quote a report that we both with Eric were working on. The report is entitled "Making the Global Financial System Work for All." And it's a report of the G20 mandated eminent persons group on global financial governance. And there is an annex, Annex 3. Well, a rather modest part of the report, just 2 pages, preparing for pandemics. So it's not that we didn't see the danger of pandemics. The problem was that the annual global cost of pandemics was estimated by us at 0.7% of global GDP. We compared it with Ebola, so to say, unconsciously even. In fact, the cost of the COVID-19 will be probably 5–6% of GDP. But what we have said, how we should prepare for this. Well, first, we should develop domestic health system. Now it's a platitude. Then we saw WHO, World Health Organization, as a pivotal in a pivotal role as a guardian of the effort to control pandemics. And then the World Bank should organize contingent finance through insurance, finance by bonds, derivatives, and so on and so on. Well, let me make a rather sobering and not very optimistic comment on this. Well, first, we never act before a crisis actually happens. It's only a reaction to a crisis that the country's politicians, let's say, pursue anything. Second, what seemed to us to be of utmost importance at that time, 2-3 years ago, but even more now, is international cooperation, coordination of efforts. But in fact, what we see in this situation is that the world is becoming more and more divided. China, US, EU going their own ways. And G20 is basically out of the play. G20 is passive. Well, of course, we know why, but I have read an article in the Financial Times this morning. Javier Solana, the former Secretary General of NATO, basically proposes to scrap G20 and replace it with some kind of body, global leadership group or whatever. But this means that whatever group we organize, whatever name we give, the pandemics, the crisis that sort of what resulted from pandemics requires cooperation, and it becomes more and more difficult because countries like the US say, well, we come first, and nothing else matters. Well, when I look back at this report of 2018, we have seen the problems of development, especially in Africa, but also in Latin America, as urgently needing proactive stance on the part of international financial institutions. Well, this is even more urgent now because the pandemics will obviously hit advanced economies, but and of course we are excited by the comparisons between the US and the EU and possibly China, but really the pandemics will hit most the poor countries or the most poor countries. There are many channels through which it may hit those countries, but let me just mention two. There is a lot of discussion about the need to shorten supply chains in global trade. Well, I don't know whether it will actually happen, but if it happens and to what extent it happens, it will mean onshoring or nearshoring at the cost of low-cost countries of Asia and Africa. But also, which is something not frequently mentioned, is the basically disruption of global tourism. Global tourism, or tourism in general, has grown to the status of the biggest industry in the global economy. And it collapsed entirely, totally. And it will probably be rebuilt only very gradually, and I am quite skeptical whether it can come back to the previous level. Well, it means that hundreds of millions of jobs in many countries around the world will be lost forever. So we have a big problem of extreme poverty coming back. Well, we were very satisfied in the last decade or so that we have halved the number of people living in extreme poverty. Well, partly due to the globalization, to the trade globalization. Now we may sort of retreat from this success. So what is needed is a very active role of international financial institutions, but not as a lender. Well, there is so much money around in the world, in the global economy, that the amounts that we are talking about at the IMF or World Bank, or taking all the regional development banks, are very small compared to the private capital potential. So the IFIs should concentrate on risk mitigation, on catalyzing the flows of capital, private capital mostly, to where it's needed. And also take a role in coordinating those flows, in putting some order in this activity. I remember that one of the best proposals that we made in that report that I just quoted is to build effective country platforms where on which different donors, different investors could sort of communicate, share information, and let's say mitigate competition, and to the benefit of the recipient country. So, well, of course, I'm now sitting in the European Parliament, so I could translate what I have said about global economy to the European economy, but let's leave it to the question and answers part of our meeting. To sum up with one sentence, pandemics showed us a urgent need to global cooperation. But at the same time, it makes this cooperation more difficult than ever. This is not a very optimistic remark. Thank you.
Thank you, Marek, and sorry for omitting the fact that you're now a member of the European Parliament, and also, of course, one of the eminent persons in the group that produced this document that you were referring to. So thank you very much. We have gone on and we have still some time, I hope, for questions and answers. So I'm going to give the floor first to a student, and his name is Adonis Karamintsos. And maybe Adonis, you can introduce yourself and what you're doing, and then ask your question.
Sure. Thank you for letting me be a part of this and ask a question. I'm a Master's of Science student at the London School of Economics. I study the political economy of Europe at the European Institute. And my question is, given the rise, I guess, in the last year in industrial policy in many countries across Europe and in the United States too, there's been a lot of discussion about introducing some sort of industrial policy to compete with China specifically, but also with Europe. And my question is, should the WTO take a stricter interpretation of what is industrial policy? And if it does so, how should it interpret this in a more, and when it litigates this out, should this question be more, this stricter interpretation be more limiting, or should it be more lenient?
So I think before thank you very much, Adonis, and I think we'll park this question and maybe for our WTO experts here. There are quite a few questions in the audience, and so let me bring up one from a former minister and Swedish minister who was is now head of the Global Challenge Foundation, Jens Orback, and he's basically asking, is it for Hector? So he's of course talking about something we haven't spoken so much about, the sort of plurilateralism and the coalitions of the willing, which has got a bad name unfortunately, but the idea that countries can go ahead in sort of not everyone needs to be involved. So can deals, this is his question, can deals or clubs, for example, on taxation on CO2 form a base for future rules and thereby be a more realistic reform? So again, can you go ahead and try to create majorities or strong coalitions on sub-topics? I wanted to include another thing which is maybe a little bit tangential to this, but I think it is an important question from another student, actually, Arvin Lee from UCL. So she's asking, will speaker comment on China's digital currency and EUM's effect on the global financial market? It's I know it's a little bit different, but it's a sort of interesting example of how new idea, new technology does intervene. And who wants to go? Maybe Hector, you can start on the plurilateralism or the idea of sort of coalitions going ahead, and then maybe Jonathan, you can take the question on industrial policy, and Marek, you take China's digital currency. As a former central banker, this is for you. Hector, please.
Thank you very much. Well, that's a very good question. I would say definitely yes. There is the possibility to go ahead with plurilateral negotiations, particularly if they are about regulations rather than about reducing tariffs. Let me explain this why. We can go with plurilateral regulations even if it's about reducing tariffs, but you need to make it WTO consistent. You basically need to, when you finish the agreement, you need to have a critical mass, what it's called, that because you have to extend the concessions to all the rest on an MFN basis. So the issue of free riders comes up. And that makes it difficult, unless, of course, you can get the WTO to accept it as a new agreement, but that would require consensus, which is quite hard. If we think about new issues, and e-commerce is one of them, and we actually have a plurilateral, at least started, in which we have China and the US sitting there, it is much more possible because it's mostly about regulations, which doesn't mean that it will be easy to find common ground. But once you have good practices on regulations and you have a club of important countries in that industry agreeing on what are the regulations that will be extended to all the rest on an MFN basis, well, then the issue of free riders is not that strong as with tariffs. So definitely that's a way to go. It has been to some extent, I would say, problematic at the WTO because many countries use the consensus rule interpreted as unanimity to object that those plurilaterals could be served by the Secretariat. I think that has been overcome. The Secretariat is participating wherever it is asked to, Not that those other countries are happy, but that has been progress, I would say. So that's my answer to your question, yes.
Thank you very much, Jonathan.
Well, just a footnote on plurilaterals. You know, it's been an approach that has been inherent in the WTO from the outset. The Tokyo round had a number of codes ranging from textiles to civil aircraft, where not all members participated, but were widely accepted. The government procurement agreement itself is plurilateral. So plurilaterals within a multilateral context are quite familiar and should not be seen as contradictory. So too, the proliferation of free trade agreements are in effect catalysts that show the way to disciplines that can be multilateralized. If you go back to the original NAFTA right through to the current CPTPP, they seem to point the way to rules that could be multilateralized. On industrial policy, you know, here too, not being an apologist, but hopefully a realist on the WTO, the basic disciplines on subsidization continue to hold. And that is to say that governments should be free and remain free to provide support to industry, provided that it not have a trade distorting effect. So regional development to compensate rural or distant areas so as to have their pricing match those in urban areas. What you do at home domestically is fine. If it has impact across borders, then there needs to be rules that help to measure and compensate for the distortion that may be felt. So while there may not be sufficient precision, the underlying principle remains constant. And indeed, state involvement in the economy, while very pronounced, as my slide showed, in certain state-led economies, is pervasive. And we're seeing that not just because of COVID, but in certain sectors, the Boeing-Airbus dispute being a good example. So it's a matter not so much of being lax or more disciplined, it's a matter of being more precise. So I'll stop there.
Marek, the EUN and the China central bank digital currency.
Okay, now you can hear me. Well, first, thank you for ascribing this question to me. I'm definitely not an expert in those issues, but as I was for some years part of the conversation among the central bankers on this issue, then let me provide some remarks on this. First, well, let's note that we are now using the term digital currencies rather than cryptocurrencies. Well, I think that it has some meaning. First, whatever we call it, crypto or digital currencies, this has a great potential in making payments cheaper, faster, and possibly also more transparent. Not contrary to what we think or we have thought. However, at the beginning, those bitcoins and others, they were an exclamation of, let's say, libertarianism or even anarchism. It was done against the states, against the omnipotence of the state. Well, it was okay. It had some initial dynamics, but it lacked credibility. And once the central banks entered this business, they can deliver credibility. So my opinion is that, yes, digital currencies are here to stay, and we have to work with them in the future. But the producers, so to say, and the patrons of those digital currencies will be central banks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have even more questions. One of the questioners has been very active and has made several questions and wrote a long intervention. He brings the topic back to governance, and Jonathan said that the problem is really not so much the institutions but the capitals. Maybe you can all comment on this, or apply it to individual institutions and saying, you know, is the problem in design of the institution? Of course, ultimately, capitals were involved in creating these institutions. But if you take WTO, is the problem that there are some design flaws in how it was created, or is it the fact that the capitals are sort of abusing the system? Of course, when you design an institution, you have to take into account the possibility that capitals become, you know, difficult and get involved in things that they maybe shouldn't get involved in, or at least should you know, the whole idea you create these institutions sometimes is to avoid some of these direct interventions. I mean, maybe Jonathan, this is home turf for you, and what is your view on this?
Well, let me offer a couple of observations. It's interesting to contrast the IMF and the WTO as well as the United Nations, because in the IMF and in the United Nations, we in effect have a shareholders meeting, be it the General Assembly or the Ministerial Council, and you have at the IMF the annual meetings. But at the UN, you have a board of directors, the Security Council. At the IMF, you have a board of directors. All the members have entrusted to a smaller group through the IMFC and the executive board at the IMF some executory authority. At the WTO, in contrast, you have a shareholders meeting in permanent session, but you have no executive, you have no board of directors. You have no steering committee or group other than an ad hoc collection of chairs of committees and councils that rotate every year. It's interesting to reflect on the reality that even in fundamental decisions concerning fiscal and monetary policy, countries have been willing to delegate to a smaller group some decision-making that affects domestic sovereign authority. They've been much more reticent to do so on trade policy. So that's one question about internal governance. The second aspect is who's your CEO or COO. And here, too, countries have been somewhat reticent to delegate to the head of the international organization very much autonomy. There's long been literature about the limits on the independence of the Secretary General to act, going back to Dag Hammarskjöld and peacekeeping and peacemaking in the 60s. What's the limit of the managing director of the IMF? And the DG of the WTO is a public voice, as other heads are, as an advocate, but in terms of actual decision-making and implementation authority, countries in this Westphalian system have not been willing to give international civil servants very much independent authority. Ultimately, it's not just the WTO, but all institutions remain member-driven. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to come in on this issue? Hector?
If you invite me, but I think that Jonathan addressed it very well. Let me just say that design flows are very difficult to correct. And design flows, I mean, some designs may not be flows. The case of special and differential treatment, I wouldn't say it was a flow in the 60s. It was quite reasonable because you had countries that had fiscal space to accommodate the adjustment that comes with opening markets, which is, you know, of course, you have some labor that is displaced. It is much faster to close an industry than to open an industry. But if you have the fiscal space to cushion that, well, you can go ahead. Now, you had many developing countries at that time, truly developing countries and poor countries, which it was an euphemism to say poor countries, that didn't have the fiscal space. So you gave them special and differential treatment. So that meant less reduction in tariffs over a longer period of time and some other privileges. But of course, that was okay for the 60s. It was okay for the 70s. It was okay for the mid-80s. It was just not okay for the 90s, even less for this century, because many of those former poor countries have far more fiscal space than the supposed developed countries. But of course, they never give up that. And they want to give it. If they want to give it up, they want something in exchange. And that's the point I wanted to make. So it is, I would say, it is not designing against capitals. It's that design is absolutely outdated. And then it's very difficult to modify.
Marek, you were part of this eminent first group. This was very much at the core of the group, you know, what to do about governance. But you have said what you had to say. Yeah. Okay. So we were promised some. Yes, Hector, you want to say something?
Sorry, I want to add one thing that I didn't have time to mention, and it comes to this last question. Why can't you modify the flawed designs? Well, listen, one big difference between the IMF and the WTO is that the IMF has a watchdog inside, which is the Independent Evaluation Office. That is totally independent from the board, of course, and from management, and that looks at flaws in the way the IMF works. And it puts proposals that the board can reject, but they cannot ignore. So you cannot just ignore problems. At the WTO, there's no independent watchdog whatsoever, which you have in every IFI and in every regional bank. So that, if you don't have somebody that brings problems to the table and forces you to look at them into the eye, then, well, you sweep them under the carpet and it will be somebody else's problem after. And then you have a wake-up crisis, which we have now.
Well, I think that is a very constructive proposal. Let's put in place an independent evaluation office for the WTO. We were promised some polling. They should probably happen earlier. Now it's going to be more of a see whether you have convinced people about these institutions. Can we get the questions from the? So the first question, is it worth rescuing the WTO, or should we rely on regional and bilateral arrangements? And maybe we should add to this also sort of plurilateral arrangement, but particularly, well, as Jonathan said, plurilateralism was always part of WTO. So let's focus on the question we did. So we have an audience that is firm believers in the WTO, I think, and very encouraging for those of us who follow and think that the election that is going on right now, or selection rather, of the Director General is very, very, very important. So I'll give you a few more minutes, seconds. So a minute has gone. So basically 88% think that it's worthwhile to rescue and reform the WTO. Can we get the second question, which is? maybe there is no second question. Okay. Anyhow, oh, here, no, yes. Where do you see the most need to strengthen the current development finance architecture? Is it about strengthening the global development finance institutions? Is it about strengthening the regional development finance institutions, like at the EU level, or in Asia, Africa, and so on, or the national development finance institutions? So these, like the KfW, the KfD, and so on. So here it's a little bit more balanced. So, of course, if you look at this historically, what has happened over the last 10, 15 years is that we have had an enormous growth of the regional development finance institutions, but of course, even more rapid growth for the national development finance institutions. And now our audience seem to have a bias for sort of correcting this long injustice to get more money to the global development finance institutions. So thank you very much for that. And thank you very much to our panel. I think we have had a wide-ranging discussions of the different, several different institutions that we have looked at in some detail, and I'm very grateful to the speakers for providing so much food for thought. And of course, as we said, it always comes back to governance, and some of that is part of the original design, but we also have to see how we over time can adjust governance, and how, because of the kind of changes that Hector was referring to, and also as part of Jonathan's presentation, these institutions need to develop over time, and some of these countries that are actually incredibly important for the world economy today did not play the same role at the time of the formation of these institutions, and it's very understandable that they want to have a greater say in what's happening, and also for the legitimacy of these institutions. Ultimately, they need to reflect the role of these countries in the global economy. So I think without further ado, so thank you very much, and very grateful for you to come to this webinar, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much.